Hello, my dear student. Once again, you are welcome to class. Today, we're going to focus on the 10th session of the course Health Services Management, and the title is Communication in Health Services Organizations. In this presentation, we're going to follow this outline. First, we'll look at the meaning and importance of communication, the various types and forms communication can take in a health setting, barriers that are there to hamper effective communication, and then we also look at how or various ways we can improve communication or we can make communication effectively. So when we say communication, what do we mean? Communication is very simple. It is just the processes by which ideas, thoughts are exchanged between two or more people to create an understanding. So communication is the process whereby actors in an organization, workers, leaders, managers, and all other people engage each other, trying to share ideas and then create an understanding. For communication to be effective, there must be a common understanding between the parties to the communication process. So in every communication process, at least there is a sender. That's the one sending an information, and then this information is sent through a medium or a device or a mode called a medium to the receiver. And for communication to be effective, there must be mutual understanding between the sender and then the receiver. In that regard, the sender can only confirm or validate this communication process through feedback. So until a feedback is given from the receiver to the sender, for the sender confirming that this is exactly the message or the idea I wanted to transfer, there is no confirmation of effective communication. And for a communication to be effective, there is something that we refer to as communicative commonality. That means the parties to the communication must have something of interest or must have something that is common to both. The parties to the communication process must have an interest, an equal interest in the process called communicative commonality. So that device or that item that links the two or that connects the two together is what is referred to as the communicative commonality, in the sense that, for instance, if someone is speaking Latin to someone who does not understand Latin, there's no way there can be a communicative commonality because the language that they need to share the information doesn't exist. So in that case, there's no communicative commonality. So language, common language can be a communicative commonality. Interest in the subject that is being discussed could be a communicative commonality, or one thing or the other which actually generates that common interest between the two parties is what we refer to here as communicative commonality. There is another concept in communication which I think is very important for you to understand. That is what we call grapevine. Usually, organizational communication takes place within a formal structure, whereby there's a formal or a laid down processes through which information are shared. However, there are some times where information is shared not through these formal structures. And when information is shared among people within an organization, but not through the formal structures, it is called informal communication. And this informal communications is technically referred to as grapevine. And grapevine is something that is essential to every organization because a lot of important informations are shared through the grapevine, though they may not be so formal. It is important for managers, especially in the healthcare settings, to be very much more aware of grapevine, because grapevine also is very important to the sustenance of the organization or the stability of the organizational climate. So it is important to understand that grapevine coexists with the formal communication structures that exist in every organization. And for example, when it comes to the health service organization, grapevine becomes essentially important because managers in health service organizations must appreciate the usefulness of grapevine, in the sense that so many important information can be shared through all sort of medium, and given the complex array of the cadres of professionals that work within healthcare organizations, there are varied interests, and it is not everybody who could go through the formal structures because of hierarchy and power differentials within the relationships that exist. As much as possible, for managers to be successful, they need to appreciate the existence of grapevine and reinforce the respective successes that this informal communication can guarantee or can give them. The second topic we focus on has to do with types of communication. Communication can be in various forms and various types, but for the sake of this course and for the sake of convenience, we focus on the following. First, the two generic communication types are what? The verbal communication and non-verbal communication. When we say verbal communication, we are basically making reference to all forms of communication that are done using words. Using words. The words in this case could be written words or they could be spoken words. So in this regard, verbal communication can be subdivided into what? Two categories, which we refer to as the auditory or the auditory verbal communication and then the non-auditory verbal communication. As the name connotes, auditory verbal communication basically means using words to communicate that can be heard, that can be spoken or transmitted in a medium that can be heard through the human ear. Others are non-auditory, but they still use the words. For instance, a letter that is written letter is a form of verbal communication, but it is not an auditory communication. So in this case, basically, verbal communication could be oral. Auditory ones, for instance, example of auditory communication has to do with oral communication, which is a subset of verbal communication. So it is not all verbal communication that are oral, but all oral communication are verbal communication. As opposed to the second category, which is non-verbal communication. When we say non-verbal communication, it is any form of communication that is as opposed to verbal communication in that words are not used, or it is a form of communication where there is absence of words. We can say this to be basically a speechless communication in which the content is not put into words, but simply expressed through other bodily expressions. For instance, facial movements, gestures that we usually do, hand movements, as you can see me doing, and there are other forms of examples, including body language, sign language, for instance, for our brothers and sisters who cannot speak, for the deaf and the dumb, sign language, touch, having body contact, eye contact, pictograms, pictures, graphic designs, and all other forms of communication, like road signs and others. These are examples of non-verbal communications which are not communicated through words. As we said earlier, for communication to be effective, the sender and the receiver must have a common or a shared understanding of the issues that are being transferred or transmitted. However, sometimes there are things that impede or they hamper or they affect this smooth understanding to exist. These are things we collectively refer to as barriers to effective communication. These barriers to effective communication, they create misunderstanding or they lead to what? Misinterpretation of the message that is being communicated to the receiver. Generically, we can categorize these barriers to communication in two. First, we have what we call the external barriers or environmental barriers, and then the internal barriers, or what we also refer to as the personal barriers. They are external barriers because they are all outside the human body, or it's a form of impediment or obstruction to effective understanding that are external to the human body, or they exist within the environment within which the communication takes place. That is why they are referred to as what? External barriers. So for instance, communication that is taking place or where there is an exchange of idea and yet there is a lot of noise around whereby the receiver cannot properly or clearly hear the sender, noise is an example of external barrier. For instance, where there is competition for a person's attention is also an external barrier. Or there's a competition for space, there's competition for time. All these things are likely to lead to what? Misinterpretation of the message that is being conveyed to the receiver. So the choice of what inappropriate medium or the method through which the message is also transmitted could be an external barrier. So external barriers are many. Anything that actually confounds or that distorts effectiveness of communication that are outside the human body collectively are referred to as the external barrier, just as some of the examples that I've mentioned earlier. The second one, which has to do with the personal barriers, as I mentioned, they are also referred to as internal barriers simply because they include all forms of distractions that are within the human body or the human beings that are involved in the communication process. For instance, where there are tensions within people get tensed, work pressure building within people, expectations being so high, fear and anxiety. Of course, where there are differences in frame of reference for both parties, belief systems, personal philosophy, selective perception, inappropriate choice of words or inappropriate semantics. All of these are examples of internal barriers. Having established all these barriers to effective communication, managers in health service organizations must endeavor to ensure that communication is effective. And how can they make sure that communication is effective? That is the focus of the next session. First, there are several techniques. As much as possible, managers must try to initiate interactions with staff that are lower in rank. Normally, there is this issue of fear and anxiety whereby people lower in rank are dealing with people upper in rank. But if that trust is built through the superior trying to establish a good rapport with people lower in rank, it improves their confidence, whereby they can engage constructively with their superiors without let or hindrance. Managers should also pay very key particular attention to the informal leaders. Leaders emerge in organization. Some of them are very informal. They may not have any legitimate or position, power, or authority, yet they have a lot of influence on other people. So these key informal leaders that exist within the organization, every manager must endeavor to establish them and make sure that you utilize them properly. As I mentioned earlier, through the grapevine or the informal communication, you should be able to discover some of these key informal leaders and make sure that there are good rapport and good relationship with them. Managers and leaders should also establish committees to engage, to quickly investigate and find out matters which bother on weak communication. Whenever you realize that there's a weak communication links or medium appearing within the organization, it is important that you quickly investigate them and seek redress or seek solutions to those weaknesses and improve them as quickly as possible. As managers must try and minimize the number of links that they use to communicate, because if you try to use too many links, let's say there are 3 different channels through which, or 3 different layers or hierarchies through which a message is sent down from top management to the lower level. By the time it gets to the ultimate recipient, the probability that there's going to be distortions in the message are very high. So as much as possible, use the least number of channels as possible, links as possible. Managers must also try to employ multiple channels of communication, of communicating complex messages to ensure that in the failure of one method or one channel, others are likely to be successful. And of course, whatever message that managers are delivering, they must ensure that they give adequate and sufficient attention to each and every message so that nothing is considered as trivial. Of course, whatever we say or whatever words that we communicate, whether through auditory or non-auditory means, the words must be consistent with actions, in that the verbal and non-verbal communication of the same message must be consistent. So there must be some consistency in the medium that we use. So, in summary, we look at what communication is and why we think it is important in an organization. We also look at the various types and forms of communication take place. And then we also discuss the barriers to effective communication and how managers can ensure that communication is improved consistently in the organizational setup. Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you in the next class.